Raven stood in the center ring of the Solstice Moot with 12 council fires burning around her, and every flame made the same truth harder to escape. If she spoke in the next minute, she could lose her blood name. If she stayed silent, she would help a traitor take the throne by inches. Snowmelt dripped from the rafters and struck the stone near her boots in slow, cold taps, while Garrick's voice carried through the chamber as if he already owned it. He called her unstable, called her ambitious, called her a low-rank runner who had climbed too close to the king and learned to forge records for favor. The gathered alphas watched her the way wolves watched thin ice, with interest, caution, and a private estimate of how quickly she might break. Across the ring, King Tobias Windrider sat on the winter throne without moving, broad shoulders still, hands resting on carved armrests shaped like wolf jaws. He had not spoken since Garrick began the accusation, and that silence pressed harder on Raven than any shouted threat. 7 years unclaimed, 6 alliance matches refused, 1 king whose restraint had become its own rumor, and now her half-brother was using every one of those facts as a blade. Garrick paced one measured circle and lifted a packet of records for the council to see. She altered lineage seals, he said, to raise her station and bind the king through pity. His tone carried practiced hurt, the voice of family betrayed, the voice that had taught Raven, at 16, how easy cruelty looked when it dressed itself as order. She could feel Myra on the outer benches, her aunt's gaze fixed on her lap, shoulders folding inward the same way they had years ago when silence felt safer than truth. Raven's pulse thudded against her throat. She remembered the first time a public ring had judged her worth, remembered laughter she still heard in winter storms, remembered a seal pressed into wax that had rewritten her life in one breath. A guard stepped closer to her left, not touching, ready. The execution block waited beyond the 9th fire, scrubbed clean for ceremony. Nobody in the hall needed to be told what happened to wolves convicted of treason under full moon law. Tobias shifted for the first time. He did not look at Garrick. His eyes held Raven's, dark and steady. And in that look, she read neither command nor comfort, only recognition, as if the choice belonged to her, and always had. Elio Thorne, captain of the Royal Guard, stood 3 steps behind the throne with a sealed satchel at his hip, waiting for a signal he would not give himself. Raven drew one breath that burned in her chest. "If the council wants truth," she said, voice hoarse and clear at once, "they will have to hear how this started in year 719. In year 719, Raven was 16, and still believed rank ceremonies were about belonging, the way elders described them to children with soft voices and warm broth. Snow fell that morning in quiet sheets over the Shadowfang lower dens, turning refuse piles white, hiding every cracked wall until noonlight exposed them again. She wore borrowed gray wool that scratched at her wrists and stood in line with girls whose names she knew from river chores and ration queues, each of them waiting to be sorted by blood, scent, and the old records nobody questioned in public. Garrick, already acting pack steward though barely past 20, presided beside the lineage table with a polished calm she once admired. Half-brother by blood, superior by rank, he had spent years teaching her where to stand and when to lower her eyes. Mara kept the record chest that day, hands careful around the seal box, lips pale with nerves she hid poorly. The chamber smelled of cold stone, wax smoke, and fear carried in wool. The first girl called forward stumbled over her own name and was marked labor rank with no claim rights. The second cried before the seal touched wax and earned a sharp rebuke for weakness. Raven watched each decision land and felt her stomach tighten for reasons she could not explain, as if the room had become a trap she was only now seeing from inside. When Mina, the smallest among them, was shoved toward the table by a guard for asking whether she could contest a result, Raven stepped out of line and caught her arm before she hit stone. Garrick told Raven to release the girl. She said the guard had no right to strike a minor at a rank hearing. Murmurs ran through the benches, some amused, some offended. Raven's voice shook, yet she kept it level, and repeated that the hearing laws required neutral handling until rank was set, because even 16-year-olds learned the rules that mattered when rules were the only shield they had. Garrick smiled without warmth and asked who had given a low-born runner authority to lecture stewards. Mara opened Raven's file. Wax gleamed on the page. Garrick leaned in as if checking a detail and pressed the Shadowfang crest beside Mara's mark. Raven saw it clearly. Crescent bite on the left edge deeper than usual, a tiny irregularity she had noticed before in old storage records. Garrick announced that Raven carried diluted line markers and failed claim eligibility, unclaimable at her rank under current house rules. Laughter broke from the upper benches, quick and relieved, because someone else had been lowered in their place. Public rejection came with ritual formalities, a black cord tied at her wrist. Her name moved from future mate registry to service archive list. Nobody touched her afterward. Nobody spoke to her on the walk back to lower dens, including Mina, who cried and apologized and could not meet her eyes. Mara passed within arm's length by the water trough that evening and said nothing. Garrick sent a note before midnight assigning Raven Dawn courier duty for the archive routes, 3 districts a day, no appeal. Raven survived that year by becoming useful where nobody looked. Archive runners carried sealed copies between dens, steward houses, and border watch posts, often in weather that bent trees and froze lashes together. She learned who stole rations by weighing sacks with her hands and who altered tax tallies by comparing ink shades in lamplight. Her rank meant she had no formal voice, yet records passed through her fingers, and records told stories people in high seats preferred to keep buried. The habit that saved her also endangered her. Every time she saw a lie in writing, she felt a physical pull to name it, as if silence narrowed her lungs. Garrick punished that impulse with schedule changes, extra routes, withheld firewood credits, small pressures designed to teach obedience without bruises anyone could document. Raven adjusted her expectations, never her core instinct. She began telling dangerous truths quietly, to the one person who still listened in full, herself. Far north in the same year 719, Tobias Windrider attended the Shadowfang ceremony as regional air monitor, not yet king, already feared for decisiveness in border conflicts. He was 29, broad-shouldered and newly scarred from the Spring Pass campaign, accompanied by Elio Thorne, who had served beside him since cadet years. Court memory later reduced that visit to protocol. Raven never knew he had been there until much later, seated behind the carved screen reserved for crown witnesses, watching a girl with a black cord defy a steward she should have feared. For one suspended minute during Mina's shove and Raven's intervention, Tobias felt the mate pull strike with a force he had once dismissed as mating hall superstition. He did not move. Moon Accord consent law bound every claim in the realm, and under that law, no reigning alpha line could initiate claim bond with a wolf below majority age. Law prevented coercion by rank, and he had defended that law publicly after seeing what forced bonds did to weaker houses. Recognition arrived anyway, involuntary and complete, and left him with no legal action that day except restraint. Restraint became policy within weeks. In late year 719, when he ascended after his father's fever death, Tobias signed an iron vow before full council, suspending mate selection until he lifted it by his own oath. The act was valid and costly. A king without declared mate invited speculation, succession anxiety, and relentless political offers disguised as concern. Elio filed 6 alliance proposals over the next 6 years, each tied to trade, troop guarantees, or border truces. Tobias declined all 6. Court gossip attached his abstention to an older wound because that story felt tidy. His former betrothed, Isolde Varin had sold Winter Pass routes to a rival house 3 months before their formal binding, and the leak led to an ambush that killed 12 Windrider guards, including Tobias's younger brother Callum. Betrayal had carved discipline into him like a second skeleton. Nobody in court saw the second reason beneath the first, not even Elio at first, because Tobias never spoke Raven's name. By year 726 Winter, Raven was 23, and known in the lower archive chain for speed, precision, and an inconvenient memory for discrepancies. A summons arrived with royal crest and dual signatures from Elio Thorne and Central Records clerk, instructing her to report to Frosthold Palace for temporary review duty. She expected punishment assignment. Garrick told her to keep her head down, answer questions narrowly, and remember who fed her through difficult years. Frosthold sat above the river cliffs like a carved mountain, walls dark with age, banners snapping in crosswind. Inside, heat ran through stone channels and made every corridor smell faintly of pine resin and iron. Raven entered through service gate with 3 other transfer runners, clutching her satchel strap until her knuckles blanched. Voices echoed from upper halls where council members argued winter stores and patrol rotations. None of it belonged to her world. Her first collision with Tobias happened on the archive stair where service and council routes crossed. She turned a corner too fast with ledger bundles stacked to her chin, met a wall of black wool and winter leather, and felt pages burst around her like startled birds. Guards reached for weapons from reflex before recognizing her. Tobias crouched first, gathering loose folios with careful fingers, reading none of them, handing each back in ordered stack. Raven expected reprimand for clumsiness in a restricted stairwell. Tobias asked whether she had slipped on ice near the 3rd landing because maintenance was overdue there. She answered no, confused by the question, and thanked him with the formal title she barely remembered from instruction manuals. He looked at the bruised shadow beneath her sleeve where ledger strap had rubbed skin raw and told Elio, without raising his voice, to move archive runners onto inner corridor until thaw. She misread that moment as suspicion management, King protecting records from low-rank handlers after a near spill. The audience in those corridors, scribes and guards and waiting aides, read something else in the speed of his order and the way his attention followed her down the stair, long after she disappeared behind shelving stacks. Raven kept her eyes on the floor and told herself cold men were predictable men, easier to navigate than charming ones. Work in central archives exposed the hierarchy from inside. High houses filed lineage updates in lacquered tubes with scented wax. Lower dens sent folded scraps tied in twine, margins crowded with corrections no one paid to process. Raven sorted both under strict chain rules, logging each seal impression by date and house. 3 weeks into assignment, she found the first irregularity tied to Shadowfang records from year 719. Crescent bite depth mismatched against official seal matrix in a way only deliberate recut could produce. She checked again under magnifier lamp. The discrepancy held. Archive protocol required reporting seal anomalies up 2 levels, which meant Garrick would be notified through steward channels before any independent review finished. Raven copied the sample into restricted discrepancy ledger and locked the drawer. Her hands shook after she turned the key, not from fear of being wrong, from fear of being right. Garrick arrived in Frosthold 2 days later on pretext of winter grain hearing. He found Raven near lower kitchens where runners took meals and leaned close enough that his breath warmed her ear. "You have one useful skill," he said softly. "And that is keeping records moving without inserting yourself into politics." He reminded her that her food credits still ran through Shadowfang channels, that Mara's position depended on house cohesion, that accusation without rank protection ended in ruin for people like them. Raven nodded through the warning and returned to shelves with her jaw tight. She tried once to hand anomaly copy directly to senior clerk. The clerk glanced at Shadowfang crest, saw Garrick's signature line on current supply docket, and told Raven the review queue was full until spring. Delay became obstruction with polite language. She began duplicating every related record at night, sliding tracings between repair cloth layers where routine searches would not look. Tobias noticed schedule changes before he noticed copied tracings. Raven appeared in archives past midnight despite runner shift ending at dusk, eyes ringed with fatigue, posture wired for sudden threat. Elio reported 2 unauthorized inquiries into discrepancy ledger access, both linked to temporary clerks sponsored by Shadowfang's steward office. Tobias reassigned archive watch rotation himself and stationed neutral guards under Elio's command outside restricted vaults, a response far larger than routine document protection required. Court whispers sharpened. A king who never lingered in Records Wing now crossed it twice daily. A low-rank runner, formerly marked unclaimable, now worked inside royal stacks with direct guard coverage. Garrick fed those whispers with calculated sorrow, telling anyone who would listen that Raven had become unstable under pressure and might compromise critical line data for attention. Mara, summoned to verify old seals, arrived pale and evasive, eyes sliding away from Raven in every corridor. The external threat came on a whiteout evening when visibility dropped to arm's length and most staff were confined to inner halls. Raven stayed late to compare year 719 witness signatures against current steward filings. She heard a latch click behind vault shelves and turned in time to see smoke thread under the door from oil-soaked cloth packed into vent grate. Fire in archive wing spread through dry binding glue within minutes. She ran for waterline valve and found the handle jammed with wire. Someone had planned delay. The nearest alarm cord hung across the hall beyond gathering smoke. Raven wrapped her sleeve over mouth, forced the jam free with sealing knife, and opened the line enough to flood lower shelves, sacrificing stacks to save structural beams. Guards arrived at her shouts as flames licked up map racks. Elio dragged one injured scribe clear while Raven hauled discrepancy chests toward stone corridor. Tobias reached the wing before the second bell and saw Raven on her knees, soaked and ash-streaked, both hands locked around a chest too heavy for her frame. He lifted it from her grip, set it behind guard line, and caught her face between his palms for one searching second, checking pupils, breath, burns, everything. "Who was here?" he asked. She gave names between coughs. He ordered immediate detentions and closed the entire wing by King Seal. Raven interpreted his urgency as fear for records, still clinging to the safest explanation. Inside that explanation, she could remain insignificant, and insignificance felt survivable. Elio later brought her tea in infirmary and mentioned that Tobias had canceled a council war budget session to oversee forensic sweep personally. That made no political sense given Winter Patrol crises, and Raven had no framework yet for reading it accurately. Evidence from the fire scene deepened everything. Elio's team recovered steward wax from vent wire and found one of Garrick's sponsored clerks missing from quarters with fresh horse tracks headed south. Garrick responded by accelerating his own narrative, petitioning council for emergency review of throne stability under an unclaimed king, whose judgment, he argued, was compromised by attachment to a low-rank relation from his own vassal house. He positioned himself as a guardian of order while his people erased trails. Pressure forced proximity. Raven was moved to protected quarters near Old Observatory Tower for witness safety. Tobias visited once after midnight, alone except for guard posted at stair, bringing a wrapped bundle of dry clothes because infirmary stock had run short after border skirmish casualties. He placed the bundle on a chair and kept distance, as if closeness itself might violate something he refused to break. She thanked him and asked the question she had avoided for weeks. Why was he spending king's hours on an archive runner with no rank leverage? Tobias looked toward the frost-crusted window and answered in the blunt cadence that made counsel fear him. "Because if I had acted for leverage, you would already be gone." He stopped there, jaw hardening as if he regretted the sentence before it finished. Raven stepped closer despite instinct to retreat. "Gone where?" she asked. His eyes returned to hers, and for the first time she saw something raw beneath control, old grief mixed with present restraint. "Away from this court," he said, "away from every man who reads low rank as disposable." Another pause followed, heavy and deliberate. "I failed to protect someone once when I trusted the wrong promise." He did not name Isolde that night, and Raven did not press. She heard enough to feel her own assumptions shift. Hostility did not fit what she had witnessed. Only fear sharpened into discipline. Elio interrupted with urgent message from outer council, and the moment closed before either of them crossed it fully. Raven stood alone with folded dry clothes in her arms, aware that one answer had opened 3 harder questions. Those questions became impossible to ignore when Elio delivered a sealed legal packet the next morning at Tobias's instruction. Inside lay certified copies of Moon Accord consent statutes, royal oath records, and the Iron Vow document signed in late year 719 with 3 elder witnesses. Tobias had included one handwritten line at bottom in his compact script: "You deserve to know the law before others rewrote it." Raven read the statutes twice. Under Moon Accord, she had been below majority at 16, and any claim initiated by a reigning alpha line would have been illegal coercion regardless of intent. Tobias had recognized her in year 719, could not claim lawfully, and chose Iron Vow to block every alternative match while she came of age outside direct royal pressure. 7 years unclaimed, 6 alliances refused. Court had called it coldness. Legal restraint and private recognition fit the evidence far better. A brief shift into Tobias's perspective belonged here because Raven later understood it through his own words. In year 719, he had watched Garrick tie black cord at her wrist and felt a predator's urge to remove every hand from her life by force, an urge he mistrusted because rank could turn protection into possession faster than any oath could check. Signing Iron Vow had resolved one obstacle clearly: he could keep law intact and prevent coerced claims arranged around him, which made waiting possible even when waiting looked like indifference to everyone who mattered. Garrick sensed ground moving under him and struck before evidence consolidated. He filed treason pre-charge against Raven, alleging she manipulated archive fire response to destroy counterproof and seduce royal sympathy. Under Moot custom, pre-charge forced public hearing at Solstice whether claim held or failed. If council accepted his framing, Raven faced execution or blood stripping. If she accused Garrick, she needed corroboration beyond copied seals. Mara held that corroboration and had avoided choosing for 7 years. Detention quarters were not a dungeon, yet cold traveled through stone and settled into bones by dawn. Raven sat wrapped in rough blanket, replaying every scene with Mara until the pattern hurt. Her aunt had seen the recut seal in year 719, had watched Garrick press it, had said nothing when a 16-year-old girl was labeled unclaimable in public. Silence had shaped 2 futures at once: Raven's exile and Garrick's rise. Mara came at last 2 nights before Moot under escort arranged by Elio. She entered with shoulders squared too tightly, as if bracing for impact. "I was afraid," she said before sitting, voice thin with shame. "Garrick threatened to expose old tax diversions tied to your mother's medical debts. He said the house would lose steward rights if I challenged him, and I told myself one girl could survive a lowered rank." Raven listened without interrupting until Mara's composure cracked and tears came hard. Raven asked whether Mara had seen Garrick recut the Shadowfang seal press. Mara nodded. She had seen him file the crescent edge in private records room 2 days before ceremony. She had kept the original filed shavings in a cloth packet out of fear and guilt, never destroying them, never submitting them. New information changed the case instantly. Physical residue could corroborate intent, and intent turned error into treason when used to alter rank rights. Elio secured Mayera's packet within an hour and sent it to metallurgist under chain witness. Results matched tool marks on disputed seals, and recut press recovered from Garrick's steward chest during lawful warrant search. Garrick's hesitation had always been proof control, and this evidence resolved it by making denial unsustainable in front of technical review. He pivoted to politics, claiming King interference tainted process, which forced Tobias into his own costly decision at Moot. He would need to expose personal motive publicly and risk council fracture. Solstice arrived with hard wind and clear sky, the kind of cold that made sound travel farther. The Moot chamber filled before sunset. Minor lords packed upper galleries. Lower-rank workers crowded side aisles where guards allowed standing room, and every face seemed sharpened by expectation. Garrick wore steward black with silver trim, projecting wounded dignity. Raven entered in plain gray and no house ornament, choosing neutrality so no one could claim she hid behind royal favor. Proceedings opened with Garrick's accusation, moved through archive fire evidence, and stalled at motive until Raven requested direct testimony under Moon Oath. She knew the cost. Moon Oath punished deliberate lies with bloodmark visible for life. She placed her palm on the oath stone and stated, with clear breath, that Garrick altered Lineage seal in year 719 to render her unclaimable and secure his unchallenged control of Shadowfang's steward succession. Gasps rippled across benches where many had attended that ceremony. Garrick attacked immediately, calling her vindictive and romantically entangled, saying she had fabricated every claim to trap a king desperate for an heir. His voice rose enough to crack on the final word, and that crack revealed fear where certainty had stood. Elio presented technical findings and chain logs. Mara was called. She walked to the ring with slow, deliberate steps and confirmed every key point: recut seal, threat, silence, retained shavings, years of complicity. Mara's testimony resolved the proof deficit. For the first time since year 719, public record reflected what Raven had seen with her own eyes, and the chamber had no procedural path left to dismiss it as personal grievance. Garrick attempted one final salvage, turning to Tobias with a bitter laugh. "You orchestrated this because you could not keep your hands off a low-rank girl," he said. "You call this justice. Everyone here sees appetite." Tobias rose from the throne. The room quieted so completely Raven heard the wind at chimney vents. He stepped into the ring beside her and addressed counsel in the clipped declarative style that had ended wars before they started. He recited Moon Accord Age Clause. He cited Iron Vow record date in year 719. He stated he had recognized Raven that same year and had refused 6 alliance matches between years 720 and 725 under oath because legal claim was impossible until she reached majority. A murmur surged and broke. Some faces showed shock, some anger, some relief that at last the unexplained had shape. Tobias continued without softening. He acknowledged his former betrothed's betrayal and his brother's death, admitted that wound made trust costly, and said he would rather absorb political loss than permit coerced marriage markets around a woman who had once been stripped of rank through fraud. Every sentence carried weight because he did not ask approval. He named fact and consequence. Cost arrived immediately. House Varen's envoy rose and withdrew Winter Grain Compact negotiated around a potential royal alliance, citing insult and instability. 2 supporting houses followed with protest over precedent, threatening to suspend Border Patrol contributions until spring review. Tobias accepted withdrawals on record and ordered reserve stores open to lower dens to offset shortages, shifting strain onto royal war stock and reducing his campaign flexibility for the season. Choice had price, and he paid it in front of everyone. Judgment followed procedural vote. Garrick Shadowfang was convicted of treason by lineage fraud and obstruction tied to archive arson conspiracy, with no direct regicide attempt proven. Sentence under Realm Code was border exile for life, escorted to Northern Watchline with no claim to steward office or council voice. He stared at Raven while sentence was read. Hatred and disbelief mixed into one expression she had seen only once before, on the day he tied black cord at her wrist. Mara was convicted of material silence and evidence suppression, mitigated by full sworn testimony and preserved proof. Counsel assigned court probation under Elio's oversight, restricting her to record service within Frosthold and barring independent seal custody for 3 years. She accepted sentence with quiet nod, relief and grief crossing her face in equal measure. Elio remained captain, case steward, and chain witness, his procedural honesty now public enough that even his rivals stopped questioning his reports. The chamber should have adjourned after sentencing, yet nobody moved because one unresolved line still hung in the air. What happened now between king and woman whose name had reshaped the council floor? Tobias turned to Raven, and for a heartbeat, she saw the man beneath rank with startling clarity, disciplined, wounded, and waiting for her choice instead of consuming it. He held out his right hand, palm open, no command in the gesture. Raven Shadowfang, he said, voice carrying to the rafters. Under Moon Accord law satisfied, under throne witness complete, I claim you as my mate and queen. He did not touch her until she moved. She felt every eye in the chamber lock onto her, the same public gaze that had once watched her lowered to unclaimable. Old fear rose and met something stronger, the knowledge that she could still walk away, and the room would record her refusal as lawful. Her active choice had cost written across it. Accepting meant severing the last functional tie to Shadowfang deference networks, stepping into scrutiny that never eased, and binding herself to a throne that would measure every private feeling against public consequence. Refusal meant preserving anonymity she no longer wanted and abandoning a man who had waited 7 years within law to avoid taking what was not freely given. Raven placed her hand in his. I accept, she said, clear enough for every bench. I choose you with full oath. Claim ritual in North Pack custom was concise by design. He pressed his thumb over the pulse at her wrist where black cord once cut skin. She mirrored the gesture at his throat, acknowledging equal vulnerability before authority. Oathfire flared blue and settled gold, signal accepted by council witnesses and lunar registry stone. Applause came hesitantly from lower benches first. Archive runners, kitchen staff, stable hands, those who knew what rank fraud looked like up close. Upper benches followed slower, some from conviction, some from necessity. The first night after claiming, Raven stood on Frosthold West Terrace wrapped in king-issue cloak that still smelled faintly of cedar and cold iron. Tobias joined her with 2 cups of broth and no attendants, keeping protocol at distance for 1 hour carved out by Elio's ruthless scheduling. He told her he had wanted to tear down Shadowfang Hall in year 719 and hated himself for wanting force over law. She told him she had mistaken restraint for indifference because indifference was safer to believe than being wanted. They spoke about Isolde and Callum without ornament, naming loss and blame and the habits those losses had built. Tobias admitted he still checked corridor exits by reflex whenever someone he cared for entered a room. Raven admitted she still expected public humiliation whenever attention gathered around her name. Neither confession solved the past, yet each made the other legible, and legibility turned fear into something they could manage together instead of alone. Winter governance tested them immediately. Grain compact withdrawals forced ration recalibration, so Raven proposed opening dormant archive maps to revive old river transport routes abandoned after avalanche years, reducing dependence on Varan caravans. Elio assigned survey teams. Tobias approved emergency labor credits for lower dens who repaired river docks. By thaw, 2 routes were running with guarded barges carrying salt, barley, and lamp oil at sustainable volumes. Political cost remained real. Collapse did not follow. Raven insisted her first formal act as queen mate address rank fraud directly. She established independent lineage review office with rotating 3-house oversight, removing sole custody seal authority from individual stewards. Mara, under probation, helped design archival safeguards she wished existed 7 years earlier, including dual impression verification and public challenge windows for minors at rank ceremonies. The reforms angered old houses and relieved everyone they had quietly harmed. Spring brought the ceremony Raven had avoided in memory for years. Frosthold hosted regional rank hearing for lower den youths displaced by border raids. Tobias asked whether she wanted to observe from screened gallery. Raven chose the floor ring. She stood beside Oath Stone where she had testified against Garrick and watched each name called with transparent records projected for all witnesses. When one frightened girl protested a handling violation, Raven stepped forward before guards moved and said, calm and firm, "She is right. Follow procedure." No one laughed this time. The guard corrected stance and apologized on record. The girl received fair review and claim rights intact. Raven felt old scar memory ease by degrees she could finally measure. Public rejection in year 719 had taught her she was expendable. Public claiming in year 726 mattered because it reversed that wound at the same scale. Yet the deeper healing came from the authority she now used to protect someone else in real time. Garrick's exile report arrived monthly through Border Watch. He remained alive, assigned to stone maintenance and winter patrol support under guard. No communication privileges beyond legal counsel requests. Raven read each report without satisfaction or pity, only clarity. His removal ended immediate threat. The habits he represented required ongoing vigilance, which suited her temperament better than triumph ever could. Mara served probation in central records with strict supervision. She and Raven rebuilt trust through work rather than speeches, side by side over damaged ledgers, admitting when memory failed, correcting each other without flinching. Some days were brittle, some unexpectedly soft. At probation midpoint, Mara asked whether Raven hated her. Raven answered that hate had kept her warm for years, and she no longer needed it for heat. Elio remained the hinge between personal and political spheres, still dry in manner, still ruthless about protocol. He adjusted guard rotations to reduce spectacle around Raven's movements while preserving security, and he trained new captains on evidence chain integrity using the Shadowfang case as teaching standard. Tobias trusted him enough to accept contradiction in private counsel, which Elio supplied whenever King instinct leaned toward force over process. Their friendship had survived war, betrayal, and now love entering governance equations. By the first thaw festival after Solstice, Frosthold Court had stopped calling Raven an archive runner as if it were an insult. She still visited the stacks weekly, still preferred ink on her fingers to jeweled gloves, and still corrected mislabeled bundles herself when clerks tried to shield her from routine labor. Tobias found her there often, sleeves rolled, lamp angled low, and leaned in doorways longer than kings had any right to linger. Their private rhythm grew from small, repeated choices. He asked instead of ordering when matters touched her history. She told him the truth quickly, even when it complicated strategy. He slept more once she began leaving archive notes on his war table with clear alternatives, forcing his mind away from worst-case loops before dawn. She slept more once she stopped expecting his attention to disappear without warning. On the anniversary of her year 719 rejection, Raven walked with Tobias to the old Shadowfang Hall now under interim steward council. Snow fell lightly, echoing the day that had split her life in two. She stood at the same ring where black cord had been tied, now cleared for reform hearing, and read aloud the new minor protections and challenge rights into House record, while Tobias witnessed without speaking over her. When she finished, he pressed a sealed copy into her hands bearing both their marks. Complete romantic fulfillment for Raven did not look like perpetual ceremony. It looked like waking in a room where her place was never up for vote, crossing corridors without bracing for public ridicule, sharing governance with a man whose authority had edges and ethics both, and feeling chosen in ways that endured beyond one dramatic night. Complete fulfillment for Tobias looked like the end of sterile control as identity, replaced by chosen vulnerability that had survived public scrutiny and material loss. In late year 726, under first clear autumn moon, they held a smaller rite for pack and staff who had carried them through the winter crisis. No jeweled crowns, no alliance bargaining, just oath renewal before those who knew the full chain of cause and cost. Elio stood witness. Mara carried registry ledger with steady hands. Archive runners lined the back wall in their plain gray cloaks and smiled openly when Raven signed beside Tobias in bold ink that did not tremble. Raven sometimes still woke from dreams where Garrick's voice echoed and the chamber laughed, and on those nights Tobias listened until the shaking eased, never pretending old wounds vanished because new love appeared. He had his own nights, ambush memories, brothers' blood on snow, Isolde's betrayal repeating in altered forms. They learned to sit through each other's storms without surrendering autonomy, which made their bond durable in a way fear never managed. When winter returned and council fires were lit for the next solstice, Raven entered the moot chamber not as accused witness, but as queenmate with independent record authority. She paused by the ninth fire where the execution block had once waited in her peripheral vision and felt no pull toward flight. Tobias took his seat. Elio signaled proceedings. Mara distributed verified seal reports. The system moved, altered by choices she had made when silence looked easier. One final image held the story's full arc. After council adjourned, a young runner approached Raven with a discrepancy note and obvious fear, expecting dismissal for interrupting royalty. Raven read the note, saw a genuine irregularity, and thanked her by name in front of two minor lords who had once mocked low-rank voices. Tobias watched this exchange, mouth curving almost imperceptibly, the expression she had once thought he did not possess. He had not claimed anyone in 7 years because law, grief, and conscience had locked him into a narrow path he refused to abandon. She was the reason he had stopped choosing anyone else, and he remained worthy of choosing only because he waited until she could choose him, back in full daylight before witnesses. Raven had been labeled unclaimable at 16 in year 719. She was claimed and crowned by consent at 23 in year 726. Every number in that span marked a cost paid, a lie broken, and a life rebuilt in public where the wound began.